All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning, evening, afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Paul Buffa. I'm the head of product education here at Observable, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about Observable, how to learn Observable and get on the platform. So we have an hour-long workshop planned. And this is supposed to be hands-on, so you get a chance to test out the platform, ask questions, and hopefully get through everything you're interested in. So I've got some folks from the Observable team helping me out today. We have Wayne here, who's going to be helping out with questions and logistics. And we have Allison, who's going to help answer any questions you might have. So feel free to put any questions you have in the chat here, and we'll try to get through it as quickly as we can. Might be fun, too, if you can just say hello and tell us where you're from. It'd be great to kind of know who's attending today. I am in Boulder, Colorado, on a very rare rainy day today. It's usually pretty sunny and dry, so it's kind of nice day to hang out inside. And we have a lot to go through today, so we should get started right away. This workshop, we're going to try to just go through really the fundamentals of working in Observable. So we're going to talk about the notebook cells, how to add data to your notebooks, how to do some simple plots and visualizations, and hopefully we'll have some time to get into interactivity and inputs. We have lots of ways that you can ask questions, again, through the chat here. We also post a link to our community Slack channel. So if you want to get more connections to the DataViz community and the Observable community, I would recommend joining that. It's also better if you've got a lot of questions that maybe you want to have, kind of a one-on-one conversation with somebody. It's a great spot for that. Looking through the chat, looks like we have people from all around the world. Very exciting. So yes, good morning, evening, afternoon. Yeah, we got people from Argentina and London and Pittsburgh and Los Angeles. That's really fun. So yeah, again, this is supposed to be a hands-on workshop. So if you don't have an Observable account, I would sign up for one now because we're going to be working in notebooks. It's free to join, hopefully pretty easy to figure out. So if you just go to observablehq.com, you can go and sign up, and hopefully it only takes you a minute just to get that going. So right here, we've got a notebook open, and we're going to be working within a notebook today. So when you've got a second, if you don't have an account, sign up and then open up a new notebook. And we do that by just simply going to the new button up here. Oh, my head's blocking it though. Here, let me move my head around. Whoop. There we go. A little studio magic. If you go up here, you can see this new button, which gets highlighted. You can't see my cursor, but you can see when I highlight the button. And that's how you create a new notebook. So when you've got that all set up, we can start walking through it. If you are getting that set up and need a minute, take the time to do that. I might just quickly walk through, for those who are set up, kind of high level working in Observable and how it works. So here, let me move my head now back so I don't block the notebook. Yoink, there we go. And I'm going to make a quick plot in Observable Notebook, adding some data in just about a minute. So again, while you're setting up your account and getting a notebook opened, I'll walk through this. So here I've got a blank notebook, and I'm just going to quickly walk through, and we'll go in more detail how this works. So I'm going to add in a data set. I've got a CSV file, a comma-separated value data file locally in a Finder window on my computer. I'm just going to literally copy and paste that into a notebook. So open up a new cell, hit Command-C because I copied the file, and now I've got some data in here. This data is around the MTA. So if you've ever been to New York City, the MTA is the Metro Transit Authority. It's what runs the subways, the trains, the buses. So it's some data on ridership levels for all these different methods of transportation. And say I want to visualize this data quickly. I want to take a look at it. I could open up a new cell to start working with this. And again, we'll go into some more detail, just kind of a high-level overview real quick, where I could open up a cell to start working with this data. I'm actually going to write a SQL on it, which is pretty fun. So I'm going to select from this table. I'm going to select my source, that MTA file. I can select everything in there. That's the select star syntax. You can see I've got a date. I've got subway ridership levels. There's a percentage. There's buses. Let's maybe look at subways. I might just open this up a little bit. Yeah, subway total estimated ridership level. So we'll select the date, make it as a date object, and then we'll select this subway total estimated ridership, and let's call this just subways. And there we go. I've got just the two columns I'm interested in. And maybe I want to visualize this quickly, so I'll call this subways by day. And now I'm going to add a new cell for that. Maybe I'll use our newest chart cell, which is pretty fun. So it selects that data. It's a kind of a no-code way of working with it. So I'll select the date, and then I will select subways. And there you go. I've got a quick chart of subway ridership levels by day. This goes back to March of 2020, which now, if you remember your history, it's getting many years now ago. It was at a little more margin. There we go. So you can see the impact of COVID when it first happened in New York City. So March 2020, and then it goes way down subway ridership levels, and it slowly ramps back up. Okay, that's my super quick overview. So hopefully in that time where I've walked through this, everyone has gotten onto Observable, has a notebook open, and can walk through. And you're welcome to, of course, also just watch if you don't want to walk through this at the same time, but it would be great to kind of have you test it out so I can answer any questions you might have. Looks like I've already got one question here highlighted. I have a question. How can I make it? I can hide this one. How can I make a graph from a SQL-specific selection? Yeah, so we'll get into this in a little bit. We'll get this more a little bit later in the workshop. So we'll get into different ways you can add data, talk about SQL and how you can work with data sets in SQL, and then use that for a graph. So great question. We'll get more into that in a little bit. All right, so I just gave you a very quick high-level overview of Observable. Let's go back to the basics. So what do I even have open here? What is this? So this is an Observable notebook. And if you've used other notebook platforms before, they all operate pretty similarly. This is sort of the main entity in which we do our work in Observable. So when you work in Observable, you'll be working in notebooks. And notebooks are comprised of cells. Cells is where you do your work in your notebook. So for this example I just did for you here, there's multiple types of cells that I use. So at the top here, I can actually open this up. I can see the code underneath. This is a markdown cell. So this is a cell that's used for writing text. And markdown is a specific type of language for writing text. It has some syntax like the little pound symbol here for doing titles. If you add more of these, it does different types of title tags. So it gets smaller the more you add. Here I've got the syntax for italics, just do an underscore there. So markdown cells is how you write text in notebooks, similar again to other notebook platforms you might run into. And then here you can see I've got another type of cell. So this cell is a JavaScript cell. I can actually see here when I click on this little symbol, the type of cell. So JavaScript, Markdown, HTML, those are sort of the main cell types we have. And this one's loading in some data sets. So I've got a local file attachment, and it's pulling in that data in a JSON structure, which is sort of the JavaScript equivalent of a spreadsheet, so columns and rows. And then I've got another cell type down here, which is my SQL cell. So in notebooks, there are multiple types of cells, and each one is good for different things. So Markdown obviously is good for text and writing some prose or poetry. And then JavaScript is good for lots of things. It's really great for doing visualization. It's also good for importing data sets and things like that. The SQL cell here is really great for writing SQL, obviously. And if you're not familiar with SQL, SQL is it's kind of weird to call it a programming language. It does have some procedural functions, but SQL is basically a way that you can interact with databases. So it's a specific syntax for working with large relational data sets. So it's pretty fun to use in Observable notebooks. So for this course, this little workshop, we're going to hopefully get you up and running on kind of each of these different cell types so you can make your own analysis, add your own data to a notebook. So again, those are sort of the main cell types we walk through. And when you add a new cell, you can see all those options right here. So we call this an Observable, the cell menu. When you click on the little plus button under a cell, you'll see all the options for different types of cells that we have. The first three are the different cell modes. So kind of the highest level of structuring for cells. So we've got JavaScript, Markdown, and HTML. JavaScript we walked through before in Markdown. HTML, obviously, is just how you can write HTML code within a notebook. So it can be useful for text, it can be useful for images, for lots of different things. We then also have all these different types of like specialty cells, many for working with data. So ones around adding data sets like file attachments, cloud files, an API, or again, the SQL cell for database queries. And we have lots of cells that just have little snippets of code that allow you to quickly get up and running. So if you say, I just want us to have a table view of the data, I can add one of these specialty cells here for doing that. So high level cell types, there's many, many different values you can put in cells. There's lots of snippets you can use, but these are kind of the highest level types of cells you have. You've got JavaScript, Markdown, HTML, and then some sort of specialty cells for working with data sets. So I'm getting some more SQL questions in here. Yeah, I'll get to that specific question there as well in a little bit when we get a little bit more in depth on SQL. So when you're working with cells in notebooks, it's also really important to know about how cells work together in notebooks. So let's start off with like a really simple cell. I'm going to start off with a JavaScript cell and just do something like a equals 1. So I'm creating a variable called a, and I'm setting it to a value of 1. Now, if I want to work with this variable, I can work with it in another cell. So I can pull up a new cell and say a times 10. So it knows the value of a is 1. And when I multiply that by 10, it gives me 10. If I update this cell, so I make this to something like 23, it's going to update the cell that uses that value, right? It's got a dependency there. So in observable notebooks, there's this sort of reactive data flow where when one cell changes, other cells that are dependent on it or using it will update as well. It's really nice compared to some other notebook platforms where you might actually have to rerun all the code to see those changes come through. In Observable, it's reactive. It happens immediately. So when I change this value, it's going to change the other values in the notebook. You can actually see these dependencies and how they work together using one of these panes over here called the mini-map pane. So these different panes are useful for lots of things. We'll start off with this one called the mini-map. And it shows you these sort of dependencies trees there. So when I click on A, you can see that value is being used in the next cell where it's A times 10. And when I click on this one, I can see what values are dependent on it. And this will continue the more and more dependencies you have. So say we've got a new cell called B equals 2. If I did A times B, I'm going to see those two dependencies now on my mini map, which is pretty nice. So when you're working in notebooks, you can use cells in other cells, you can use those values. And when you change those values, everything's going to update in your notebook that is dependent on those values. So again, it's a nice way you can write little code snippets, little smaller blocks of code, and kind of reuse that throughout your notebook, rather than having to write all the code each time and having to make all those changes. I'm going to just take a quick peek over here to see if there's any more questions. It looks like, yeah, we've got some SQL questions. We'll get through that more in a little bit. Has everyone had a chance to get on to the notebook? And if you've got any troubles getting a notebook and getting that set up, the team is happy to help. So feel free to ask questions here if you're like, how do I add a new notebook? How do I get here? I'll just pause for a second, see if there's any. I guess everyone is in a notebook, which is fantastic. Great. Okay, so we talked about adding cells, talked about dependencies. Say you want to remove a cell or do other changes to cells. You'll notice down here we have this little menu bar where you have a cell open. So if I click on this cell, you can see there's all these options down here. There's the option to run the cell, and ooh, maybe I glossed over that. That's an important one. So when you make a change to a cell, it doesn't actually update yet until I run that cell. So you'll see here there's a little play button. Close this mini map. There's a little play button to run that cell. So I can click on that to run the cell. Another option is to click on the play button down here to run that cell. So I got two different play buttons. You can also use the shortcut, which is what I use, which is Shift-Enter. So Shift-Enter to run the cell. When you're just running lots of cells quickly, it's kind of nice just to use that little keyboard shortcut. And if you actually hover over this play button for a second, which you can't see again when I'm screen sharing, you'll see that option that shows you the command for running a cell, Shift-Enter. So you can do that with cells. You can run cells. Say you want to delete a cell. So let me go to this one. I'll delete this cell. You click on this button down here, the little trash can button. It'll say delete, making sure you're confident about it. And then you can delete that cell. You can also click here as well if you want to delete that cell. There's another option here. Let me just see. Can you see it when yeah, you can see that. Great. You can see this little menu when I open up the little menu over here. You can delete a cell that way as well. Yeah, so what's the shortcut for new cell or navigating through cells? So there's a bunch of different keyboard shortcuts. I'm honestly like, I don't use them that often. I just get so used to just like the UI. So there's a whole list of them we have in our documentation for all the different types of keyboard shortcuts. Theoretically, you could do everything just on a keyboard, but it's not usually my workflow. So I won't say I'm like an expert in all the keyboard shortcuts. The one I use mostly is the sort of Shift Enter. There's a few other ones we'll get through in a little bit. Yeah, thank you. There's the link to all the keyboard shortcuts. You can do things like double tap on the plus button there. That'll automatically enter a JavaScript cell, which is pretty nice. And I think if you do that, you've got an empty cell, you can actually use the left and right arrows to change the cell mode. I remember that right. Maybe it's a different one there. But yeah, there's a ton. There's really cool. There's lots of ways you can use the keyboard shortcuts. But yeah, I'm kind of used to some of the more UI elements. So deleting cells, adding cells, pretty important to know. Another great thing with cells that's really nice for working on analysis and iterating, maybe through a visualization, is the duplicate cell button, which many people don't know about. So if I click on this cell here for the MTA data, and down here there's this little like plus with some like folders, I guess, behind it, some files behind that icon. If I click on that, it'll duplicate the cell in my notebook. So if I'm working on a visualization, say I've got, I'll just put a little snippet here, a bar chart. I'm testing out this bar chart. I want to maybe change the fill color. Let's change this to steel blue. I'm like, I like this one, but let me try something else out. I'll just duplicate that cell, run it, Shift Enter, and then I can have both copies there. And now you can see I've got two of the same values. So it's a nice way, again, if you want to just kind of like save a copy, test something out, that could be a great way to do that. You can also maybe want to move cells around in your notebook. So you'll notice there's other different little buttons down here. There's these up and down arrows. That's how you move cells in your notebook. So if I push this up, it'll be moving up my notebook. It's taking up the full view, so it's a little hard to see, but it is now at the top of the notebook. Let me do with a smaller example that's not so tall. You can see here, yeah, moving this value up and down, making my notebook look a little crazy, but that's how you move cells around a notebook. So if you want to organize it for a presentation, you kind of like jotting down some ideas, but now you want to summarize it and share it out with folks. Moving cells around can be really nice. You can also just drag cells. I think my screen is a little, here we go. Yeah, so I can do it this way. I can click on this little menu here and drag it around, which is pretty nice. Another little secret trick, which you may not know about, is the mini map. You can actually move cells around here as well. So I can actually drag them in the mini map, which is actually, I've been doing a lot more recently, given that it's kind of a condensed view. So it's easier to see all your cells and kind of fast to move them around that way. So lots of ways of navigating through cells, adding cells, removing cells, deleting cells. Okay, I think we've talked plenty about different types of cells. Any questions before we've moved on? All right, so here, let me delete these cells because we're going to make some visualizations. Clean this up a little bit. Maybe I can leave this here. Take out this one. All right, let's get into how you add data to your observable notebook. So typically in Observable, most people work with data sets, works great with data sets. So let's go through how you can do that. There's many different ways that you can add data to observable notebooks. Some of the easiest ways is probably through a file attachment. So that's what we walked through before. So I added this file mta.csv to my notebook so I can work with that data set. So you can use this file attachments pane to add data to your notebook. By clicking the plus button here, it'll open up the menu to say select some files. So you can do it that way. You can also drag and drop in here. So I've got like a local Finder window open, which you can't see, unfortunately, because I'm sharing just my window here, the Chrome window, but I can drag that in. And and I'll add that file to my notebook. You can also, as I mentioned before, literally just like copy and paste a file. So if I've got a file locally, like I got some XLSX file for Excel data, I could literally just Command V that into my notebook. So again, really nice if you want to just quickly add that. You'll notice it updates here in my file attachments. So we support, most types of files. You can really upload almost anything in here. There is a limit to how large the files can be. So you can only upload a file up to 50 megabytes. So pretty big. You can do a lot with 50 megabytes. But if it's really, really large, you might want to break that down or try ways of condensing the file. One actually cool notebook I'll just highlight real quickly. So I can pull up in here. Let's look for CSV to Parquet. Put in 1 second. Here we go. This is a cool helper notebook that converts CSV files to a Parquet file. So a Parquet file is like a really condensed file type. So you can take a file that is, it's saying here, 80 megabytes and get it down to 5. So it's a great way for working with larger data sets. You can just kind of condense it. And then in a notebook, you can work with Parquet files in SQL, or you can convert it back to CSV if you like. That's kind of one way to get around sort of the file limit around 50 megabytes. You can also work with cloud files. If you've got a Microsoft Teams account or a Google Drive account, you can connect to cloud files this way. This is available only though for Pro and Enterprise, so it's not part of the free tier. You have to upgrade to a Pro workspace for that. Database connections as well is part of our Pro and Enterprise offerings. So if you want to connect to databases, that's the way you do that, to like a remote database, so like a MySQL or a Snowflake or a Postgres. That said, there's other ways that you can run SQL in a notebook without connecting to a remote database. And I was showing that for you before a little bit. So I actually I put in this MTA data and I started writing SQL against it. So how is that? How was I writing SQL against a CSV file? Well, that's using a framework called DuckDB. So DuckDB, it's really cool. We've been adopting a lot more DuckDB on Observable recently. So it's a way to run SQL databases in the browser on the fly with lots of different file types. So I can create a new database with a CSV file, with JSON file, with a Parquet file, and then just run that as a SQL database. So each file that I add, say for example, would be like a different table in that database. So before here, I was actually writing some DuckDB for pulling up this data set. So there's a question before about some of the syntax here. You'll notice I did this like : date. That's because I'm using DuckDB. And DuckDB has its own flavor of SQL, as every different version of SQL does. It has a lot of functions, I say, to most common SQL libraries and languages like Snowflake or Postgres. There's some specific syntax there. So this is around like changing the value type. So making sure that date is treated like a date and not like a string. So if I remove this, you'll see up here in my summary that it shows it as a string. This is a date, and now it's going to show up as a date. Same thing for integers here. I think it defaults to like a big int, which is a very specific type of variable. I call it as an int, and now it handles it correctly as an integer. Let's see, we got a question. Can you run Observable in R? There's other tools out there that allow you to kind of incorporate Observable with R. I think there's some new developments around running R in the browser. So you could potentially try to get R running in an Observable notebook. But for the most part, we work a lot in JavaScript in Observable notebooks. That's kind of our go-to language, and as well as SQL. So we do a lot of SQL in here. And a great question here. Is there a tutorial article? And I'll just highlight this one. It's a good one. On the computational rules model of an Observable notebook. Yes, we've got a whole asynchronous course you can check out that talks about a lot of this. It's called the Learning Observable course. I'm kind of walking through this high level right now of what we wrote down there. It's on our tutorials page. So if you go to the top of the notebook, click Learn, click on Tutorials, you'll pull up our tutorials page. which has all these different notebooks that walk through how to use Observable. And the Learning Observable is kind of what I'm walking through today. And it goes through a lot of these topics in more depth. So definitely check that out. All right, so we've got data loaded in from a file attachment. We're working in some SQL. Another cool way you can load in data into notebooks is through just live APIs. You can, anywhere you've got some data in an API, you could bring that into a notebook. So for today, I'll talk through one that doesn't require an API key. If you do use an API key, you probably do want to make sure you use a secret for that. So secrets are ways of kind of storing API keys without other folks being able to see it. For today, I'll just walk through one that's open and totally public. I like using, I'm originally from New York City, so I use a lot of like New York City examples. I live in Colorado now, but I lived there for many years. Oh wait, no, that's not the right link. Here it is. So New York City has a great website called NYC Open Data. So there's lots of data sets you can use from the New York City open data set, and they all are free. Many of them don't, I think almost all of them don't require any API keys. So it's a great way to just kind of get up and running with some data sets if you want to test them out. So this is one around, again, that data set I showed before, the daily ridership levels. I can also access it from an API, which is pretty nice because then when the data updates, my notebook would update as well. So if I want to get this data, I click on API here. It shows me the API endpoint. I'm just going to copy that. And then I can go into my notebook, and let's scroll down a little bit. We'll get through this section here. I'm going to open up a new JavaScript cell. And here I'm going to use the D3 library to pull in this data. There's a nice function called d3.json. Very simple to use. You literally just write d3.json, and then you put in that endpoint, and voila, you've got now 1,000 records from the NYC Open Data. So it shows me the same data set as before. So when this data set updates, all I have to do to get the new data is rerun this cell. So every time my notebook loads, it reruns the cells. So every time if I checked it every day, it would have the newest data. I could also set up like a little JavaScript function that maybe pings it every, I don't know, hour or something like that. I don't think it updates that frequently, but there's lots of ways you could have that data refresh. So APIs is another great way to just load in data quickly. So if you also are looking for data sets and you don't have any on hand, you're trying to find something to play with, we've got a bunch of data sets on Observable that you can work with. And this gets into another really core function of working Observable, which is the import functionality. So when I'm writing a notebook here, I'm writing all of these cells. This can live on in many different ways. So it doesn't have to stay in just my notebook. So when I have a named cell, and it's important here that it's a named cell, can't be for a cell that doesn't have a name. This one's a named cell because it says a name and then an equal sign. And you'll notice down here in the menu, it also says that name again. I can import this notebook into other notebooks. So if I click here, there's going to be a copy import option. And it probably will make an error message if I do it in my own notebook because I already have a cell called sales. So I'll probably be like, whoa, sales is defined more than once. But that's the import functionality. So when I'm working in notebooks, each notebook is essentially a mini library. So I can actually import this notebook into other notebooks. I can import cells into other notebooks. So I could write like a notebook of functions that I want to reuse for lots of different analyses. It's a great way to do it is through imports. So I mentioned before, if you're looking for a data set, we've got a bunch of data sets that you can import into your notebook. So I'm going to pull up, I think I've got one of the links here already. So yeah, there's this notebook we call curated data sets that are interesting data sets that we've worked on and found. Some of them are real, some of them are mock data. This is one that I worked on fairly recently called Pizza Paradise. It's a fake data set on a pizzeria franchise. And it has a lot of records. It's got like over 2 million records on orders and things like that. So if I wanted to work with that, I could just click on this notebook here. It's even got that import written out for me. So I'm just going to copy and paste this. I'll go back into my notebook and I can import the pizzeria database. This is using, again, DuckDB. And now I've got that data accessible in my notebook, so I can work with that. So let's say I want to write, well, actually, maybe let's explore the data with another specialty cell. So I mentioned before, we've got a bunch of like specialty cells working with data. We talked about the SQL cell. There's also one called a data table cell. This is a great kind of like no-code solution if you want to work with data sets. So it's all done through like a UI. I can select my Pizzeria DB. It just usually takes a second to load up here. There we are. And let's see. There we go. Now it's going to tell me select a table. So I can select one of the tables in this data set. Let's look at maybe orders. This is a large data set. It's got some, I think it's over 1 million. You'll see here it's adding up. It's at some point, it's like streaming in right now, about 1.2 million records. Maybe just for now, since we're playing with this. Oh, sorry, it's over 2 million records. Let's just look at the first 1,000 results. So the data table cell is a way I can look at this data set, again, with no code at all. It's just done through the UI. And what you get here with the data table cell is sort of this spreadsheet view of the data. So I can see the different rows, the values in there. I can see the columns. I can also get these little summary charts at the top of the page, which is nice. So it's a great way to like quickly explore your data, get a sense of what's in there. And all of these charts are interactive. So I can literally just drag on them and create subsets of the data. So if I want to look at the distribution for, order totals that were looks like somewhere between $10 to $20, I can filter results that way. So it's a pretty fun way to work with data. I can select different columns I'm looking at. Maybe I don't care about those. I can sort the data. I can filter the data. I can work with it in lots of ways. So it's a pretty powerful tool to kind of quickly get a sense of your data sets. Another cool part about it too is that always with Observable, we love coding, we love programming. You can export to code if you like. So you can start off with a data table cell and you're like, now I want to work with it in SQL. You can see the option underneath to convert to SQL. So now I get the SQL query for what I just did there, which is pretty neat. Let me just take a quick look, see if there's any questions coming up. Oh, what's the difference between D3 and Observable? Yeah, we're going to do visualization in a second, so I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Any other questions as we go through lots and lots of different stuff? Cool. All right. So yeah, let's write a query for this and start visualizing the data. So we'll get into some data visualization here, and we can answer that question about D3 and Observable. So I've got this query that was generated from my data table cell that does, it's got the order date, it's got the number of items ordered and the total value. Let's maybe just do like a count of orders by day. We can also maybe sum up the total, something like that. So here, I'm going to write a little SQL query. So we've got our table orders from the Pizzeria database. I'm going to do that thing again where I try to change it to a date object. We'll just rename this as date. I like a very specific formatting of my SQL queries. I use this all the time. Okay, so we'll do maybe just like count star as num, as it's called, orders. Count star, that'll count all the records that I'm looking at right now. So it's all the records in the orders table. If I group by something, it'll count all the records that I grouped by. And let's maybe do, make sure that's an int, integer. Let's maybe also sum up the number of items. So we'll do sum and items. Again, make sure that's treated as an integer. This against all just like DuckDB. If you were doing this in Postgres or Snowflake, you wouldn't have to keep doing these like, as an integer and stuff like that. So we'll call this num, let's call it items. And then we'll do a sum of the total here. So sum total. And so much int as, let's just call this revenue. And we will group by, so we're going to aggregate by the first column. So I'll just do 1, which will aggregate it by the order dates. We can also order it by the order date, so order by 1 ascending. So now I've got a nice little summarized aggregated values here. So the number of orders by day, number of items, number of revenue. So say I want to make like a bar chart of the number of orders by day. I can now open up my cell menu And here, as I mentioned before, we've got the cell types, we've got the data cell types. We've also got a bunch of code snippets for working with data sets for visualization. So I can type in bar chart here. I just start typing into the cell menu, and I'll see all the options for code snippets for bar chart. So let's maybe do the temporal bar chart since it's over time. I'm just going to swap out my data. You'll notice that when I put in a code snippet, it just adds in some dummy data. This is from a weather data set. To work with this chart, I have to name this cell something. So I'll call it orders by day. Grab that. And down here, I'm just going to swap out the values. So I'm going to put in orders by day. This is called date. Make sure. And then let's do, I think it's just orders, we called it. Oh, and it's by day. Oh, it might be that there's so many results here that it actually kind of gets hidden. Let me make this an area chart. Yeah, there's like, it's so granular, the results, that when you do a bar chart, there's like a little space in between. And when there's so many bars, it sometimes just like disappears because the space is taking over. So kind of a crazy looking chart. What did I do here? Okay, so I added in a cell menu, a little code snippet for a bar chart. And what it added here was this JavaScript code using a library called Observable Plot. So Observable Plot, it's a JavaScript library. It's an open source library. You can use it anywhere. You can use it outside of Observable if you like, for visualizing data. Now, Observable Plot, it's built on top of D3. So what is D3? D3 is a very popular library in JavaScript for building data visualizations, specifically bespoke, custom, interactive visualizations. So D3 is not commonly used for your very simple bar chart and your very simple line graph. It's often used by editorial groups for building, interactive scrolly-telling visualizations, by like the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the Economist. It's also used by a lot of businesses that want to build custom applications for working with data sets. So maybe, again, getting beyond the simple chart forms, getting into like network graphs or Sankey diagrams or sunburst diagrams, more complicated things that are really hard to do with some out-of-the-box tools. And it's very, very popular. You'll see it used, again, in lots and lots of sites. And the thing with D3, though, is it can be hard to learn, and it can be verbose. So for building something like a simple bar chart, D3 could take 50 lines of code to do that because you have to specify everything. With that great power and customization comes a lot of extra work. So when you're building a bar chart, you have to specify, the axes that you're going to build out and like what the tick marks should look like and all the scales and the canvas you're drawing on. It can be a lot to get something simple up and running. So a few years ago, I think it's about 2 years now, the Observable team built Observable Plot, which is built on top of D3 to give you a lot of that same expressiveness without as much code complexity. So a bar chart is actually fairly simple to write with Observable Plot. And the relationship between D3 and Observable, the founder of D3, Mike Bostock, is the co-founder of Observable. So we have a lot of the people that maintain and still work on D3 on the team. They work on Observable, and now they work a lot on Observable Plot. So that's sort of the relationship between those three different areas: Observable Plot, D3, and Observable. Just want to check for any more questions. Okay, I think we're good. So Observable Plot, it's again great for kind of the simpler chart forms. When you're going to work on something I said like really complex, like a force-directed graph, that's where you want to kind of go back to D3. But you can also use the two in conjunction. So you'll notice here, like I'm writing this plot, so I'm calling plot. I'm specifying the marks, so what I'm going to render on the page. So I've got an area mark for doing this area right here, which takes the data and some parameters. So I'm saying it's going to go by date, orders, and interval. So the data is by day. By specifying the interval, it knows how to handle those dates correctly. So like, for example, the x-axis here, it's not literally showing me every single date in the data set. It'd be so granular that I couldn't read it, right? There'd be like overlapping labels. Because I specify this interval and I say, oh, it's by day, it knows how to handle that. It interpolates the values for me. So it can say, oh, you're looking at a few years, you probably want to look at the months and maybe when the year marker happens. So that's what's happening for me here. And I'm specifying that interval using a D3 function, D3 UTC day. So I'm specifying it's by day. You can see then I'm using D3 with plot together. So you can do this in many different ways. You can use D3 functions. You can just write custom D3 code in here if you want to add more interaction and things like that, but it can work well together. So how does plot work? Yeah, I just talked about a little bit there with a quick explanation of what we're looking at here, but it's built on this sort of grammar graphic style of visualization, which is very similar to other frameworks out there you might have worked with, like ggplot or matplotlib. It's kind of a common way of writing visualizations that allow you to kind of specify a few key areas of the visualization. So the scales, the marks that are going to render on the page, any transforms. We've got great extensive documentation on plot in Observable. So if you just search for plot, and I'll just do that to show you how it works. So then I'll open up a new thing here. I'm going to search for plot. Introduction to plot is the first option. Click on that. And here are the plot docs. And they're great because when they're in Observable, all the code is available to you and it's interactive, right? So I can just open this up. I can mess around with it and see how it changes the results, which for me is like the best way of learning, just like tinkering around with things. So these docs are great. It goes through all the different types of marks you can add, all the different settings you can do. We also have these cheat sheets that are really nice, which I'll open up here. Let's do one for the marks. And these cheat sheets, which you can actually even download and print if you want to hang them over your desk because you're referencing them all the time. You can go down here, though. There's an option with like a UI, so you can play around with different settings. So, for example, like the area mark, you can change things like, the fill color or the opacity. You can change the way it does the curve. So the default is like a linear curve interpolation. You can change it to like a step or a bunch of different types here. So it's a fun way to kind of play around with it and see what the different settings are. So let's go back to our notebook. So here I've got this, again, simple chart with plot. And again, I could use different marks here if I like to. I could use a line chart if I wanted to. So let's do a line Y, and then it's going to show me a line. Again, looks a little crazy with the data set because it's so granular, right? It's like by day. And often when we look at something like this by day, you're going to see that sort of seasonal noise of like day of week trends or something like that. I can actually change this to UTC month, and it'll aggregate the values for me by month, which is a nice, just kind of simplify the noise a little bit there. When you're working in plot, you can actually layer marks on top of each other. So you can add more and more to your visualization. You don't have to use just one mark at a time. So say, for example, I want to do that. I want to show both the breakdown by day and by month. I want to see both. I can do UTC day for one mark, UTC month for another mark, and then I have this beautiful visualization where clearly you can see all the trends. Kind of a moire effect here with the lines. So I can also style these marks to maybe make it easier to read. So I'll change the stroke for this one, maybe make it to like a light gray. I'm just putting in the hex code here. You can just use also the common web colors. I can just say like light gray. Line break by accident. Now I can see both marks there. I can do one as an area, one as a line, whatever I like. So you'll notice there too, like in plot, you can actually do some data manipulation as well. So it's not just purely visualization. There's also some nice ways of aggregating data together. So by specifying the interval, and I wanted to group things by month versus by day. I could also do things like a window function if I want to do like a moving average. So let me just add one of those. I'm going to do it maybe in lieu of my month aggregation. So I'm adding in those results again by day. I'm just going to run that. You can see, yep, that's back there. So I want to add a little window function. I can actually just kind of nest functions in plot together to get that analysis done. So I'll write a plot window Y function, which means I'm going to aggregate the values along the Y, which is by number of orders here. I just have to specify by default, the minimum things I specify is the number of units I'm going to look at. So since this data is by day, the number of units will be by day. So I can say 7 to do a 7-day sort of moving average. The default is an average. And that's how I get that there. So plot, there's lots of ways to just visualize data, ways of aggregating data. Won't walk through all of them because there's tons. I would say check out those docs, but it's pretty interesting to check out. Any questions so far? I feel like I've been going through so much different content here. All right, so we've gone through plot a little bit. Before my first example, I actually did a solution that required no code at all. So say you're like, I don't really know much JavaScript. I'm not interested in getting right into it. Maybe I want to start off something a little simpler. There's another option, which is a new feature we just launched like 2 or 3 weeks ago called the chart cell, which is a no-code solution for building visualizations. It also uses plot, but instead of having to write out plot code, you can use a UI and drop-downs to create your visualizations. So before we were building that MTA data, we had that MTA data set here, which was by date and subway ridership levels. I used this UI to create the visualization. So I specified the X value as date, the Y value as subways, and I immediately got this chart here. Let's play around with this a little bit, but maybe just to make this a little more interesting, I'll add some additional values. So let me go back to my data, the MTA data. Another thing I actually didn't go through before is this database pane. So this is another way to kind of get a quick glimpse of what's in your data set. So let's go to the MTA one. I can open this up and I can see all the values in my data set. So it's a way to get that kind of schema overview. It works well for databases. It'll show you all the different tables in there and all the values, or even just, again, like a local file, you can see all the values really quickly. So there's a bunch in here. Let me copy this buses one. That could be interesting to add. So I'll do buses, again, parse as an integer, call it buses. Let's do another one for the Long Island Railroad, the LIRR. I'm originally from Long Island, used to ride this railroad all the time. So we'll call this as railroad. And yeah, I think that's fine. We just do 3 for now. So when I rerun this, oh no, I got an error message here. Wasn't expecting that. Let's see. Something wrong with that LIRR data. I'll take a look at that later. But for now, I'll just remove it so we don't have to go through that right this moment. So I've got now subways and buses together. You can see the values for both. And again, like the data table cell, you get those summary charts at the top that are all interactive if you wanted to do some subsets of the data. But let's just use the full data set for now, 971 rows. And we'll go down to our chart cell. So again, for the Y, before I selected subways, but now that I've added buses, I can actually select that value as well and get a look at that data. So these little arrows on the channel here allow you to kind of pivot between different values, which is nice if you want to just, again, quickly explore your data. When you are working in chart cell, it will try to figure out a lot of things for you. So for example, when I just selected date by itself with nothing else, no Y channel selected, it automatically created a chart for me. How does it do that? So there's a function in plot called plot auto, which is a function that tries to build plots for you with the least amount of information possible. So if you select something like just the date, it'll say, okay, maybe you want to make a bar chart of this data of the count of records by date. That's what it's doing by itself. So it's automatically looking at your data, trying to figure out what the best visualization you can make with it is, and it shows that to you. So chart cell, it's using that to come up with this. So I can always override what those defaults are, but that is how it's working. So I'll go back to subways here. Again, by default, it's going to show me the value over time. There's a bunch of different options here for how I want to reduce those values. I think, yeah, the count was what we showed before. Distinct is going to be the same thing. The sum, it's going to try to aggregate it here, which is grouping by month, basically, to show you ridership levels. So lots of different ways you can do it. You can also change the mark and how it's visualized. So again, it's going to automatically try to figure out what makes the most sense. So before, when I just did the auto, which was just showing you the values there, it said, oh, this makes sense to be a line chart, which I would tend to agree with. I think this works pretty well for this data set. But if I did something that was aggregated, it was going to start showing me a bar chart here. I can override this by changing the mark. So again, default is bar for this one. I could change it to a line if I really wanted to. I think a bar works better, but you could do a line. There's area. There is dots, which I don't think works very well, but you could do that if you really wanted to. But yeah, there's lots of ways you can kind of customize this. So We're doing something over time, so it often makes sense to look at a bar chart or a line chart. You could also do like scatter plots to show a relationship between things. So let's just go back to the default here for subways. I'll also select buses. And now I get a scatter plot view of the relationship between buses and subways. So it's kind of interesting. You can see if there's like, a sort of linear relationship, if like more people are riding the subways or more people riding the buses. It looks like there's a pretty strong correlation between the two. You can do that. You can specify things also like color values. So you can base that. You can just like give it a color if you want to, or you can make it based on something in your data set. So like the subway ridership levels, which here again, because it's plotted along the y-axis, it's going to kind of be linear along the y-axis there. You can also size things by different metrics. So here I can size it by the number of bus ridership level. So change the size of that. So lots of different ways you can customize it. This data set doesn't work great for faceting, but there's ways you can also facet your data to show breakdowns, make like kind of small multiple versions of it. Let me see if I can grab a quick query for that. Let's see if I have one on hand. That would work really well for, it might take me a second. I'll have to share some links out afterwards to talk about faceting. But faceting is a great way to kind of break down things into small multiples. All right. Any questions before we go through the last 9 minutes? Happy to go through anything you want to go through. I was thinking in the last bit, I would talk a little bit about interaction. All right, I'll just jump into interaction then. So we talked a lot about pulling in data, working with data, building some visualizations, different cell types. But say you want to add some interaction into your analysis, a way for somebody to change the results on the fly, but not necessarily have to write any code or anything like that. We have a whole library dedicated to that called Observable Inputs, which are different wrappers around common HTML inputs that allow you to easily add interaction to your analysis into your notebook. So when I open up the cell menu here, I can type in input, and I'm going to see all the different options for inputs that we have. And I think there's something like a dozen or so, maybe 15. And any of these will add some input to my notebook. So you can see there's the common ones like a button, a checkbox, a color input. Maybe I'll start off with that one. So when I click on that, I get this new code snippet for an input. It's using the inputs library. This one's for color. So if I run this cell, shift enter, I can see the color there. I can now use this variable inside another cell. So before I just kind of hard coded the background color is light gray, I could put in color here. And now I've got input that's powering this color. So when I change this value, it's going to change the color for me. So when I click on it, I'm not sure. Let me see. Can you see when I click on that? No, you can't see it. So a little HTML window pops up when I click on this that allows me to change the color, like common color wheel sort of input. And I can change those values to whatever I like. And now I've built some interaction there. So this is kind of for like a styling example, which is really helpful if you're actually working with designers and you want to get their input, allow them to make some changes. You can actually set up a lot of that through inputs, and then they can make their own variation of a visualization, for example. But let's maybe use it for the analysis. So here I did an example of doing a window function, a rolling average over time that I just hard coded in though 7 as the number of days that I wanted to look at. Maybe I want to open this up to try out different groupings. So maybe more than 7 or less than 7 days. I can use an input for that. So I can open up the handy cell menu. I'm going to look for input, and maybe I'll select a range input. So one of the sliders. So I can just run this. You can see it's a slider input, and I can change those values. So I'm going to just select this variable name called range. I can name this whatever I want, just using the defaults for now. And I'm going to swap out the 7 with range. And now when I change this variable, it's going to change the results. So it's a nice way, again, I can kind of play around with analysis, tweak some parameters to see how it changes the results. Got a question here. Can you export these charts created using plot? Absolutely. There's many different ways you can export your data, export your visualizations. So when you click on one of these visualizations on the little menu over here, you always have the option to download the SVG or PNG. So if it is built with SVG, so Observable Plot uses SVG, you can download to SVG, which is really nice if you are using another tool like, say, Figma or Illustrator, and you want to make like really custom changes. You can actually take a visualization, download SVG, and make edits that way, which is pretty cool. So that's option number one. Another option is to embed this visualization. So say you want this to live on another website. Let's call this something called My Awesome Visualization. You have to have a named cell to embed it. When I click on this, I now will have the option to embed. So I'm actually going to change the access level for this notebook so I can get all the embed options. I'm going to change this to view unlisted. So anyone can access this link. It's going to actually just rerun it real quick. Where was I? Here we go. Lost my spot. Where is it? Down here. Here we are. My awesome visualization. So if I want to, I can actually have this live on another website using an iframe. So if I click on the option here to embed, I'll get a new window. It shows all the different types here. And iframe is the default type. So I can just copy this little logic here for the iframe and now embed this into another window. So, it could be on a different website, something like that. If I actually open up an HTML cell, I can just run it that way. And then I think it's taking a second to load just because like it's pulling from a data set. Seems a little slow right now, but that's one option for embedding. There's also more options if you're like a real full stack developer, you want full controls. You can actually embed it with just runtime with JavaScript, so a little JavaScript code. You can run it that way. You can also embed it with React. So you can treat this notebook like another NPM module, install it in your React app, and then just pull in the code snippet for pulling up this chart. So lots of different ways you can embed. Can we save observable projects on GitHub? I think some people have made solutions that allow you to save notebooks to GitHub. I think there's some things out there like that. So you could probably search on Observable for some solutions like that. But generally, people just save their notebooks on Observable. So that's typically the workflow that you see. There is also the option to download all your code in your notebook, and you could also add that to GitHub if you like. So if I go up to the top here, click on this option, there's an export download code, and I'll literally download everything in my notebook. All the code, all the file attachments, all the dependencies. If I import other notebooks, it'll pull those in as well. So that's a way you can just run it locally with like a simple server or post it on GitHub. Great. We've got only a few more minutes, so please, more questions. I'd like to answer anything that's coming to mind. I can walk through more stuff as well. Always happy to. Version control functions. Yes, great question. That's another cool feature. There's just so many features and so little time. So if I click on this pane here, this is called the history pane, which is a really great way for version control. So I can actually see all the work that was done in my notebook, and it's saved as a different version. So if I click on those, it'll take me back to that version, and I can revert to that version. I could fork it. I'm just not sure why I'm getting this temporary edits thing right here. I can make changes to it. I can actually do like a pull request. I could like go back to that version, send it back to the original author. So this is a great way for version control. And we work with other people in notebooks, which we didn't even get to collaboration features. Is a whole nother area. You could see who did what, and it'll show you that version, and you can kind of revert back that way as well. Oh, yeah. So forking. Forking, let's go to another notebook here. So I'm going to go to the Explore page. And say I'm looking at some really cool notebook like this one about dinosaurs. I love this notebook. I want to have a copy of it on my own and make some changes to it. I have an idea of how to make this notebook even greater. I have more dinosaurs to add. I can fork this notebook, which will make basically a copy of the notebook to my workspace. So I can use it in my personal workspace or this team workspace here. So forking allows you to make a copy of a notebook, and then you can make changes. You can just keep it for yourself, or you could make a suggestion back to the original author. So, say you wanted to do a version of this, I wanted to change the color to this color. I could then make a suggestion, and it would send it back to the original author to be like, hey, check this out, the suggestion. And I'll see it like a normal GitHub style, like a merge request of all the variations and options. So I can see like, what code was changed, which sections, and it'll show me the differences. We are at time, so I want to be conscious of time. Yeah, it's pretty cool. There's so many different things here, and we're happy to walk through more of that. But since we're out of time, we'll probably do that asynchronously at this point. So we mentioned before, there's a Slack channel where you can talk to us, talk to the team, ask us questions. We're happy to walk through anything. So we'll put the link for that again here. You can open that up and join that Slack community and talk directly to the team. We also, again, I noted before, have the tutorials page, which is a great way to find more asynchronous materials if you want to learn more observable. And it goes through all the stuff, things I didn't get to today, like forking and collaboration as well. You can also go to our documentation page that has literally just like everything in there, all the functions, all the features, and pull it up that way. In addition to other videos. So our YouTube channel has many different videos on this. I will lastly say there's a bunch of upcoming courses that goes into other topics in much more depth. So we have a course starting next week with Allison Horst, who's our TA today, been helping out around an introduction to data wrangling in JavaScript. So if you are new to JavaScript, you want to learn some data wrangling, I would definitely check out that course. It starts next week. I believe it's 4 sessions. And it's going to be a hands-on interactive course. It's going to be awesome. And then in May, I will be teaching another course on SQL. So if you're like, I love learning a little SQL, but I need to learn more, come take out that course. I don't think we have a hard date for it yet. I think it's going to be about mid-May. We're going to start, I think, about 4 sessions, still hammering out the details there. But that will be like soup to nuts, learn everything about SQL so you can get up and running quickly. So thank you, everyone. If you have additional questions, ping me in that community Slack channel. I'm happy to walk through it. But I really appreciate you attending today and checking this out. So thank you so much. And hopefully I'll see some of your work on Observable soon.